Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Kelvin Smith Library. For those of you who don't know me, I am Tim Robson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Kelvin Smith Library, and I want to welcome you to the second of our 2007-2008 series of digital library lectures. This is the third year that we have done these lectures, and each one is better than the one before, so we're looking forward to our lecture this afternoon. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to take just a moment of personal privilege to point out an article that is in this week's issue of the New Yorker magazine by Anthony Grafton. The title of it is Future Reading, Digitization and Its Discontents, or Discontents, I guess, depending on how you wanted to pronounce the word, and it is one of the best summaries that I have seen about projects such as the Google Books project, the Open Content Alliance, and other things. It's very even-handed. It talks about the benefits and the downsides of these mass digitization projects. And if you have heard several of our other digital library lectures in the past, you've heard other speakers talk about it. So I highly recommend this article in the New Yorker, the November 5th issue. Today our speaker is Professor Mark Kornbluh. He is the director of Matrix, the Center for the Humane Arts, Letters, and Social Sciences at Michigan State University, where he is also professor and chairperson of the history department, and he's also a professor of computer science. So he comes with a quite wide vita. I have heard him speak in the past and was very entertained and elucidated by his talk. I do want to mention that these lectures are funded by the Mario M. Marino Fund for the Innovation and Application of Information Technologies and the David R. Bender Endowment Fund for Library Staff Development, and we are very grateful to those funds for providing support. So please now welcome Mark Kornbluh.
Thank you. I wanted to highlight where I'm coming from. You can't take me out of history. I'm a historian, and so I want to talk today about the digital world and where it's headed and how that relates to libraries. And I'll find refuge in history because historians make very bad prognosticators. We leave that to our political science colleagues. I also, for the last decade, have directed a humanities technology center that's really designed at the intersection of the study of the human record and human action, computer science, information science. It's called Matrix. I'm not going to advertise any of our projects here and show it off. At the end of the question and answer period, if people would like, I'd love to talk about some of the projects we're doing that fits this. But I'm going to talk more generally about this transformation. So when I try to think about the digital age and where we're headed, I by nature go back and think to the past. And the world that I grew up in higher education and that we all live in depends upon the printing press. We all know that scholarship as we know it is based upon movable type. Without it, we wouldn't have reproducible books. We wouldn't have books that were locked in. We know, when a book has a publication date, it's published by someone, it's locked in, it's immutable, it's reproducible, it can be preserved, it could be disseminated. That's what our universities are based upon. Before that, the type of universities that existed with monks writing manuscript by hands are very different than the universities that we know today. But the universities that we know today depend not only upon technology, but a particular political economy as well. The Gutenberg press is, you know, half a millennium old, but it is really the late 19th century industrial revolution that made it possible for books to be produced cheaply. That cut the cost of paper so enormously that we could afford mass education. So it's technology within a particular political economy that creates the modern university that we know today. Within that university, and I think I'm very comfortable calling these universities print-based universities, because that's what they are. Libraries have provided the basic infrastructure for them to work. Libraries are essential to preserving and disseminating information. Without libraries, you don't have research, you don't have teaching. The scholar has to have access to scholarship, and libraries were the custodians for that scholarship in a print-based world. The teacher has to have materials to hand out, and libraries were the place where the teacher turned to get the materials to hand out. And there's always been a direct correlation between the strength of a university and the strength of its library. I'm preaching to the choir here, obviously. And it's no happenstance that the universities with the best reputations, the strongest faculty, had the strongest libraries. In this print-based world, there was vast inequalities. You know, Harvard and Berkeley, and those were libraries that produced particular type of universities, very different than community colleges. Vast international inequalities. I've done a lot of international work, and all one has to do is walk into the main library of the University of Ghana and realize this place is in trouble. If there are no books on the shelves and there are no journals there, there's very limited amount of scholarship that can take place. So that's the word. So that's what I look back to when I begin to think about how this world has changed. If we want to say in a half century, but particularly in the last 25 years. The digital revolution, I believe, and I'm going to show you that major funding agencies believe this, represents a fundamental paradigm shift. Instead of having knowledge locked in print, now you have all content is reducible to bits and bytes. It is mutable, as we know. No longer do you have a copyright date and are you sure when this book is produced. Any digital piece of content can be altered, changed, edited. Hard to tell the difference between the original and the different one. Enormous challenge there. Reproducible increasingly at no marginal cost whatsoever. The memory costs are going down, storage costs are going down, transmission costs keep plummeting. So whereas a book always had a certain price that limited it, how many libraries could own it, who could afford it, content now is reproducible infinitely, almost at no cost whatsoever, portable, can be moved everywhere. That's a dramatic change that universities have to figure out how to deal with. The computer power that makes that possible is being harnessed for discovery, for analysis, for publication, for dissemination. Rather than the printing press I showed you before, it's now computers that are breaking knowledge down, transferring it, publishing it, used for dissemination. And there's a dramatic change then in scale, capacity, complexity of information that we could deal with. I often use things to hold up when I give talks like this, and I hold up a really thick book and then compare it to a very teeny computer disk, and that computer disk can hold 10,000 of those thick books. The scale and complexity of information changes dramatically, and in the last decade, the internet on top of this is creating a second communication revolution. So what's happened is that we're at a moment in time when lots of people are beginning to say that there's a paradigm shift underway. In Europe, they talk about something called e-science or e-research, and there are e-research initiatives. And E used to stand for electronic. The way we say digital, they said electronic research and electronic science. But E now in the EU stands for enabled, that science, research are being enabled by the new technology. In the United States, in the health sciences, we talk about informatics the same way. Bioinformatics, different ways that we're enabling new types of science research with the use of computers. And the National Science Foundation has picked the ugliest word possible to talk about this. They talk about cyber infrastructure, that we're at a moment in time when we're shifting to a cyber infrastructure. 4.5 years ago now, the NSF published a report, Revolutionizing Science and Engineering Through Cyber Infrastructure. And the premise of this is that we're at the dawning of a new age of research. And this is both being pushed and pulled. It's being pushed by the new technology. The technology is enabling us to work with information on a completely different scale. Progress in computing, information, computer technology is enabling this. And what's pulling it is the complexity of the issues that we want to think about in the universities. From the science perspective, things like global warming, cancer, major complex issues that require a different level, the NSF believes, a different level of research. As a historian, I would say the same thing. We no longer just want to think about the career of one individual. We want to think about history as an interaction of large numbers of events and much more complex. How does environmental change interact with different peoples and groups? So the scholar is pulling this because we want to deal with complexity in a different ways. And NSF argues, and I think I agree, that we've reached a threshold. Capacity to make a huge shift. Now, when that report was published 4.5 years ago, those of us in the humanities and social sciences said, wait a minute, this isn't just happening in physics, this isn't just happening in astronomy. The same thing is true in art, the same thing is true in history, the same thing is true in anthropology. What we do also is going to be dramatically affected by the new digital age. So the American Council of Learned Societies, with funding from the Mellon Foundation, said, oh, we better get on board fast. So they created a commission to look at cyber infrastructure in the humanities and social sciences. And 1.5 years after the NSF report, the ACLS Commission published a report called Our Cultural Commonwealth. And the ACLS report tried hard to make this ugly word mean something that we could understand. And when NSF originally started thinking about cyber infrastructure, they were almost thinking about the interstate highway system. Okay? In some ways, I'm a historian of modern America. When I talk about economic development in the last half of the 20th century, I talk about how laying down those ribbons of cement was an essential feature of the industrial explosion of America in the late 20th century. What it meant to tie cities together, to build beltways around them. The interstate highway system is an essential infrastructure to understanding economic development in the late 20th century. So that was the original model when the NSF started thinking about cyber infrastructure. But as they looked into this and looked farther, and when the people on the humanities and social sciences started thinking about it, they said, wait a minute, it's not just the hardware, it's not just the ribbons of concrete. It's actually a lot more that we're thinking about when we're talking about cyber infrastructure. It's the whole social system, say, around driving, if you want to use the same metaphor. It's not just, if we want to think about the interstate highway system as the infrastructure for modern industrial America. It's not just the cement, but it's also the fact that we drive vehicles with 4 wheels on them, and they take certain type of gasoline in them, and there are lines on them, and we license people to do that, and you drive, and there's a whole set of cultural practices, and people are trained into how to drive, or not to drive as successfully as like, but there's a whole social system. There's a whole political economy that's connected to that highway system. And it's together that you have an infrastructure that underlies the industrial society. And so we need to think about cyber infrastructure in the same way. It's not just about bigger, faster computers, but it's about new types of research environments. It's about new type of social ways to tie together research, to use computing tools in a totally new way. I got too long a quote up there to be on PowerPoint, folks. This breaks #1 rule. So the ACLS went on and said that it becomes less mysterious when you think about the fact that scholarship already has had an infrastructure. Libraries, books, the way we read books are part of an infrastructure, are part of a way that we've had distributed, that we've communicated information all along. If I hand anyone in this room a book, it would take you about 90 seconds and you could tell me what that book is about pretty well. You could tell me its authority and the basis and the chapters and probably a fair amount of the argument in a very short amount of time. That's a huge cultural system that is built up over 500 years that's at the core of how we do scholarship. All the things that go into libraries, that go into publishing, that go into museums, all those things are the basis of scholarships in the contemporary university. Well, the challenge is, how do you build a cyber infrastructure that does all those things? How do we even begin to think about what needs to be translated over into the computer world? So the challenge here is that infrastructure is embedded in what we do as scholars, as teachers, as researchers. When it works well, it's invisible. You don't even notice it. You don't think about all the things that go into letting you drive a car. If we did, we'd never get in a car. We don't think, we train students by the time, well, I was going to say by the time they get to the university. By the time they get out of university, we expect that all the facets of reading books and articles and thinking about them become second nature. And there's a complex mix of physical structures, the ribbons of cement, legal and social systems, licensing and the like, economics, all those come together as part of infrastructure. And those are also expressed in human conduct, in human expertise. Policemen make the roads work, librarians make universities work. You get the information exchange, okay? Without the expertise that's embedded in running the transfer of knowledge in the institution, it wouldn't go smoothly. And the challenge is it's invisible to start with. Universities don't appreciate this enough. Okay. So what's the challenge then? So for people who have done this in a print world, for an institution that has grown up over hundreds of years to provide these services to print universities, what's the challenge for the cyber world, for the digital age? The challenges are enormous. Unprecedented amount of content, volume of material that no one ever imagined. If we looked at the amount of books in the largest libraries in the world, there's no doubt that our access to digital content will greatly exceed that in the near future. The changing nature of this content. Libraries were mostly about books, some special collections, but mostly about books. The library of the future, the content of the future isn't just books, it's multimedia, it's video. Our lives are being recorded. They're increasingly going to be recorded. The anthropologist of the future, anyone doubt the anthropologist is going to want video as opposed to field notes taken in a particular order to recreate something, or the historian's going to want to see the footage of things? So that the audio content, video content, active databases. The Center for Disease Control today updates its databases minute by minute when new evidence comes in about the relationship between different diseases and environmental factors. How do you preserve that? How do you link that back to scholarship that's built upon that? That's what we need. If we want to understand AIDS, you want to understand cancer, these are the tools that we're using to understand that. But how do you provide access to you? How do you preserve it? How do you link it to scholarship? What is the scholarship that's going to be produced about that? In many ways, it may be an active database itself, which is increasingly difficult to preserve. And not even to mention three-dimensional and holographs and much richer environmental content. So access means volume, it means different types of material, but increasingly I think access also means to make content useful, right? Books were made useful. Librarians in a print world made books useful. They got them into people's hands and they wrote papers from them and they worked with them. Well, digital objects can be used in a lot more ways than books could be used. We never liked when people cut things out of books and pasted them on something else, but everyone today wants to cut and paste. They want to manipulate digital objects. They want to be able to work with them. They want to change them. So it's not just locate and finding digital objects, but the challenge is to build environments when people could use digital objects. Much of the NSF report on cyber infrastructure is about this issue of use. In astronomy today, the total amount of knowledge we know about the universe doubles every year. The data on astronomy doubles every single year, so it's growing exponentially. And these are in databases and huge collections. And the astronomy profession is trying to figure out ways that people can work with this data in a digital environment and make it meaningful. Well, the historian wants to be able to work with digital data in the same way as well. The challenge also for publication and communication. People turn to libraries today to publish. Librarians have been at the forefront of saying, hey, this is crazy that we're paying others to sell us the scholarship of our own faculty. We are producing the knowledge in campus. How do we publish this information? How do we make it available? How do we communicate it? We need to, in a digital age, we need to be able to share and collaborate around data. Increasingly, the challenge is scholarship takes place in a collective realm, people working together. Most physics papers today are authored by around 100 people, some astronomy papers by 1,000 people. You need an environment, 1,000 co-authors. I don't know how you get tenure credit for that. I have enough trouble getting my junior colleagues promoted when they have 2 co-authors in history. But collaboration increasingly takes place. And how do you build environments where people can share and collaborate around information? If you had one book, you recalled the book and you gave the book to the next person, right? That's not, now you can create multiple digital copies, so everyone could have a digital copy at the same time, but really the challenge is to create an environment where people can interact around the information and collaborate with it. And then how do you curate and preserve this? It's shocking. If one reads the NSF report on cyber infrastructure, the word curation is throughout the entire thing. The traditional role of librarians and archivists. How do you make sure these databases, these huge collections of information, the publications around these informations will be available in the future? our creation of digital objects has far, far outpaced our ability to be confident that we can preserve and curate these. Okay, so what do we know about these digital objects to start with? Now I'll get controversial because I think some of you will argue with me about this later. But the first rule I would argue is more is better. Now, one of the roles of most people here are librarians, not archivists, but one of the traditional roles of archivists was to throw things out, to select. And the role of librarians, in part, was always to say what's more important than other things and to do authority. But in science, at least today, what really promises change, what promises not evolutionary but revolutionary change in our understanding of the world is that we're working on a larger scale, a larger scope, larger breadth. The Human Genome Project is every gene, not selected, not samples. The World Virtual Observatory that's collecting information about the sky is collecting everything that we get from every telescope. Not figuring out what's the best observation and only selecting those best ones. And the historian wants to say that I don't know what the historian 100 years from now is going to want to preserve. I can't possibly know what the question of the historian 100 years from now wants. I want everything saved too. Because the amount of information opens up the possibility for new understanding of our society. Historians 100 years ago didn't think black people and women had history. They threw out that stuff. History was about great men doing, in politics. The idea that writing cultural history was a subject matter worthy of preservation and collection would have been scoffed at by the founders of the American historical profession. So you don't know what is going to be most useful. The astronomy observation that looks like noise, that isn't a clean observation today, 10 years from now, the computer may be able to separate out, and that may be the key to changing something. So there's within the science, at least, the idea is that that you collect everything you can, and that by having more junk means better science. That simple. More junk means better science. The more information you could collect, the greater the observation points, the more you could do with it, because now you can harness, and the trick is to build tools, build electronic environments to work with that stuff. Now, part of the reason why the scientists believe more is better is because they're looking at more complex issues. Complexity, issues that involve people from different disciplines, different expertise. Bringing together biochemists, biologists, chemists, and environmentalists to look at the same issue. How are we going to understand global warming? It's not an issue for one discipline. It's not by, at least the NSF doesn't believe, and I'm convinced it's not by narrowing down information. It's by widening the circle and the scope of information and creating new complex understandings of them. Also, both of the reports from the NSF and the ACLS argue that what we really need is the ability to collaborate, to be able to work with this huge amount of material with new tools, new collaborative environments, new ways to harness the computer to understand what the data says, new ways to visualize. In the print-based world, we visualize by text. We read things, and today, for the most part, we still read things. If we use Google and you use all the most advanced computer tools, it's still 95% verbally based and text-based, and people are typing things in. But scientists are increasingly looking for ways to visualize patterns, to see things differently, different types of interfaces. ways to simulate, to use simulation simulation is increasingly seen as a new branch of science. It was theoretical science and experimental science, and now this simulation science, where you actually don't do the experiment, but you do it all on the computer, and to see things and understand things differently. So more is better. And we're going to have this big, messy problem that it's not just technology, but we have to deal with the political economy. That everything, as we shift from a print to a digital world, copyright, the legal regime is incredibly important. What you can do with this information, who controls the information. We have all these technical problems, but we have all these legal constrictions around us. And the same thing is true when you were building highways to connect an industrial society. There was a technical problem to bank those roads the right way, but there were all sorts of legal structures around this, and adjusting the legal structure is important, and figuring out how to do it within the legal structure is an enormous challenge that all of us who work in the digital world have to face. And I would stress that we also have to think about the economy. We've lived in a copyright regime that Mickey Mouse controlled for the last 25, 50 years, right? Disney and the studios were among the most powerful owners of intellectual property, and they controlled the Millennium Copyright Act and what copyright is. Well, the studios are now completely dwarfed by Google and the like, Google and Yahoo and Amazon, by corporations that are making their money by selling ads around information. They don't make any money by hiding anything. Google makes all its money by putting stuff out there. We haven't, I'd be happy to talk about Google Book Search and what I think about it and the like. But aside from what you think about what you're doing, the big players in the economy and in the information world have changed dramatically in a way that Wall Street understands, but we don't think about very much in the academy yet. And I think that really it opens opportunities and it presents problems. So it's always technology within a particular economic environment to understand. When I want to think about the library, if I step back for a minute here, I'm about out of time. If I want to talk about how cyber infrastructure in the library can support a historian in the future, a humanist in the future, I want to think about a library that goes beyond books and the articles, that finds a way to support, save, preserve, make accessible different types of publication, hypertext, publication that is in multimedia. Today in my classroom, when I have a student write a paper, I make them write a paper with audio and video and images embedded in the paper. Because I want them to, historians today want students to look at a wide range of evidence. We've wanted students to think about pictures. Libraries have collections of images. Well, one way to do it is you make them work with it. You never before could have written a paper where you actually have the picture. Now we can do that. They copy the picture in and they analyze it. They put in oral histories and they tell me what they hear in the voice and why this oral history is more convincing than the other. Historians are going to want to be able to publish that way, publish in complex objects. In science today, the slogan for Bill Clinton's campaign when he ran was, "It's the economy, stupid." In science today, the slogan, "It's the database, stupid." Everything is in databases. You have to be able to manipulate and move and work with stuff. Well, I can envision the history of the future using the power of databases as well. We had a meeting a few years ago of historians that do digital history, and we tried to imagine what would be our ideal project if we guessed out into the future. We had a glass of wine. We said we'd play political scientists, and we'd pick out in the future. And the narrative, what we tried to imagine was if you could write a history of the settlement in North America, the contact, that had all the information that we know about that brought together into one environment. So you would have all the stories from the settlers and the diaries, but you'd also have the evidence that we've now gathered from Native American cultures and what they, how they responded, so you had their point of view, but we were able to draw upon geologists, and we knew how the environment had changed and the weather had changed, and if you can write that in an environment where you could change some of the variables. What if the historian said, hey, what if this was two really cold winters in New England instead of the weather that allowed the settlements to settle in? Or what would make a difference if disease pattern was different and smallpox didn't spread through the North American, Native American population in the way that it did? Could I write a history 100 years from now where my students could see and visualize this and manipulate the parameters? I'm pushing it hard here, but that's the type of history that I think we want to imagine writing, and that's the type of thing that we're looking to build a cyber infrastructure to support. Not 10 years from now or 25 years from now, but that's the goal, is to write that type of history that's live, active, engaged, and draws upon all the different information, every discipline, and all the collected information. Okay, my final thoughts here and the challenges. This is a disruptive technology. The digital world is changing everything. It's disrupting things. It's opening doors to new players. Corporations come in out of nowhere and suddenly become really important. In universities, this is a real challenge. For libraries that have played a central role in supporting scholarship and supporting research, supporting teaching, this is really important. I think it's really important to do the type of experimentation, practice, regardless of the scale that this library is doing, for example. You have to get your feet work, you have to wet, you have to play with it, you have to move forward, or you get left behind, or what the commercial marketplace does completely replaces it. Resources are important. It costs money, obviously, but so is creativity. I think if you take people who understand what supporting scholarship and teaching means and challenge them to think about what that means in a digital age. They're starting with a great deal of knowledge base. They're having provided the infrastructure in a print world. That's really important. That's harder to come by than the programming expertise. You can hire people to do the programming expertise. I believe that all aspects of universities will be transformed. I know lots of people think that, well, gee, the dot-com bust came and went. Everyone's been saying this for a long time, that, digital world's going to change the way universities work. But history shows us that it takes quite a while. There's a huge lag between the disruptive technology and then a real dramatic change. The invention of incandescent lighting didn't change the way factories worked in America overnight. You had to build different types of factories, ability to different structured factories, and then suddenly 25 years later manufacturers woke up and discovered that manufacturing was going on completely differently in the United States. And I think the same thing is true, that the university of the future will be IT infused in every aspect, and I fervently believe that libraries are a core feature of this cyber infrastructure, and that universities can't do this without libraries making this transformation and leading this transformation in many ways. That the knowledge embedded in libraries is essential to move forward in this digital age. We don't want to be led by the developers of Facebook. We want to be led by people who supported scholarship in the past and then challenged the technologists to incorporate those values into the new IT-infused university. Thank you. Hi.
I'd like you to go on a little bit more about the role of databases and the infrastructure in relation to history. That may be a lead in the matrix, I don't know, but.
Well, I could tell you for what my center has tried to be at the intersection between the humanities and information science. How do you take digital objects and make them available for use is what we've really focused on. So we have a big project that's just coming up, that actually just went live, it hasn't been publicly announced, called Overcoming Apartheid, where we've been collecting for about 8 years, working in South Africa, doing video interviews, oral interviews, documents, images, and these are all in a repository that's similar to Fedora, but it is designed to let you build complex digital objects out of it, to do things with it. So it is possible then to write lesson plans, pulling, very simply pull a picture and put it into a lesson plan. It is possible for someone to write a article, pulling pictures, and embedding it into it. That's a very simple sort of use of database, but to make the digital objects usable and reusable in that way. The other really big project that we have is called the Quilt Index, which has been funded now by NEH and IMLS at 5 different stages for over $2 million. And we now have funding out for 3 years. 3 years from now, we will have almost 1 million quilts from 42 different museums and collections around the country, from the Daughters of American Revolution Museum in Washington to Hawaii to Alaska. We have all these quilt images, and we have, because this was done in collaboration with museums that paid a great deal of attention to metadata, an enormous amount of metadata connected to these quilts. And it'll be possible then to curate exhibits of quilts from any of these 42 collections just by, point and click and pull them over and write things without having to move them around the country. Now, it's not the same as going and visiting a museum, but it still allows new types of exhibits, new types of collections. So that's what we've been able to do now. Now, our research goal with this is I want to take this quilt collection and I want to ask humanities questions of it. So I want to say, for example, if I have 1 million quilts, I have lots of quilts that were done by white quilters and black quilters. And I know that African Americans in this country moved from the north to the south in the middle of the 20th century. And I want to ask questions that historians ask about this. Did this mean more integration or not? So can I ask a computer scientist to look at these quilts and say, did they become more similar or dissimilar as African Americans move into other parts of the country, or as Southeast Asians move into the upper Midwest in the 1970s, Laotians move in? Do we see an influence of Laotian culture on local quilts? Or quilt patterns start being published in the penny press around the turn of the century, and scholars have always argued that, the sort of growth of mass culture in the 1920s, and it becomes more uniform and the like. Well, I have a database of 1 million images. Let me query that database. If I can take, I can take all the images that were published in the penny press, and I can query them against this database. Do quilt images become more similar to those that are in the press? Is there less folk culture, more mass culture? We've only been able to ask those questions as an individual art historian, trying to systematically sample quilts. Now I'm going to have this huge collected database, and I can ask and I'm going to harness the power of the computer and see if I could ask this. Now, maybe this, we can't do this now. I believe that, advanced visual recognition computer scientists will be able to create measures of similarity and dissimilarity that'll let us play with this data. This is a research proposal to NSF. We're going to use a lot of the curators in these museums will be a test against what the computer scientists determine. So if they say, yes, these quilts are similar to those, and there are 100 of them, I can have my curators look with their trained eye and say, hey, this computer is out of whack. Or they might say, hey, boy, we never would have picked these 3 needles out of a haystack and found this. So that's the type of research project that I think we need for humanities technology to try to figure that out.
you mentioned copyright briefly and mentioned that it's basically driven by economic considerations, previously studios, now maybe other information disseminators are going to get into it. But I'd like to hear your ideas on how it would interact with, will interact with scholarly studies. For example, you just mentioned the Quilt database. Presumably pictures there are born copyrighted under the current thing, and suppose people try to put restrictions on it. How do scholars deal with it? Or slightly differently, you said you get your students to write papers with visual and audio material in it. Those, each picture on the web that somebody brings down presumably has a copyright attached to it. How, you know, so maybe those sound minor, but how do you see this all playing out?
No, I don't think it's minor. I think it's this enormous hurdle for us to deal with. I mean, I guess I believe in the provision of the copyright law and the Constitution, which was for the advancement of the practical arts. It wasn't for the profiting of, you know, people who. It's so you advance creativity, not profit after the fact in the way that it's been interpreted. I think that there are enormous economic factors right now that are coming to bear for increased access, which is what librarians and museums and archives have really fought for. And you know, in this regard, I think Google and Amazon and eBay, which we don't think about in these ways, but they make their money around people being able to have access to information, are actually our allies. My students write the papers out of Library of Congress's collection and, you know, Boston Public Library collection and New York Public Library. So libraries have been at the forefront of making available as much as they can make available in their collections. And American museums have been pretty good about this too, certainly compared to British collections and the like. I think that knowledge, you know, the advance of knowledge is by having access to more stuff and more access and the ability to work with this stuff. One of the real problems with the copyright regime is that is not just the cost, but the cost locks it into proprietary databases, proprietary systems, and the inability to work from one collection to the next. So. You know, there's no one here from the Mellon Foundation. I think the Mellon Foundation made a horrible mistake in their decisions to, you know, support these collections that were, you know, no matter how affordable they were made, they're you know, JSTOR's been locked off from other things. The Luca Art Store are separate. And what we need is the ability to move between different collections and to aggregate and to compare and to work with digital data. In contrast, say, every piece of astronomy, so my vision is very much informed by hard science here. Every astronomical observation today is made freely available to the world within a year after it is taken. Nobody monopolizes the results of anything today. All the money that funds any astronomy research is predicated on making all that data available to everyone to work with. This is very different from a world where astronomers were trained very carefully to grind lenses or to work with radio astronomy, and they carefully guarded their own data in order to publish from it. So there's been a total revolution in provenance of data in geography and astronomy and a lot of the hard sciences, and that's what opening up you know, enormous scientific discoveries. I think the same is true in biological sciences, that the pressure to get at that information is so powerful that so the human genome has been made available to researchers, and I think we want the same for our cultural heritage.
But all the data is not created equally. President Bush decides he wants to land a person on the moon, and all of a sudden dozens and dozens of worthy projects at NASA and elsewhere have to be put aside because the money's not going to be there for them. And so we have a politician deciding what kind of data, or to some extent, what kind of data is going to be available. So there are costs attached to creating data. And then there are costs attached to storing, curating, and disseminating data. Costs are going down radically, but tough decisions have to be made by librarians, for example. Take your South African project. 50 years from now, what form will that data be in?
Yeah, no, I think the cost, the second part especially is a real challenge. We don't really, we barely glimpse the costs involved in curating and preserving and migrating this data. This is, you know, this is an enormous challenge. I actually think the stuff's being created because, you know, everyone owns personal computers now, and the tools to gather things, to write, to take video is growing. You know, the type of information that we want to preserve is growing geometrically, you know, like this, even though, yes, political and economic factors adjust how that is. So, but the pile of information is growing like this, and we're barely struggling to keep up. We don't know how to deal with this data yet. I mean, we barely are just beginning to have repositories to deal with the most simple data types. The most simple data types. I was on the National Academy of Science Advisory Board for the Electronic Records Project for the National Archives. And the only thing they're comfortable preserving today is fixed field databases, comma delimited. And we left those behind 15 years ago. You know, they can't work with Word documents. No, this is an enormous challenge, and there's a political economy challenge too. There's no reason why, you know, if the government's a big purchaser of computer stuff, we can't mandate that if you want to sell it to the government, you have to put XML headers into every Word document, and then we might have a chance to preserve it. But yeah, I think that that's really the challenge. And so what you do is, what we do at universities is we're picking at this and trying to figure out, and each little piece is working and talking to each other. There's a lot of big economic power being put to some of these same issues too, and it may be true that, you know, maybe Google or another company we've never heard of is going to come with data preservation strategies and curation strategies that we don't know of. But I think, you know, universities have a pretty good record in the long run, actually, of this type of research.
Paradigm shift in the way we do research. I'm a historian as well. And I'd like to get your reaction to two thoughts that sort of circle in my mind. One, Roy Rosenschweig's last article was about the Wikipedia. And in that article, he posited that the day of the independent scholar researcher might be replaced by corporatized research, such as you see in the Wikipedia. So that's one aspect. And the other thing is that your students, my students, myself, you, we use digital information to produce text. And the entry into the profession is still locked into text. It's the dissertation, it's the book. Is that problematic?
I think the infrastructure is the whole set of, you know, trained practices and expertise and assumptions, and yes, that, you know, figuring out, moving that moves slower than the technology. So the professional culture moves slower than the technology. You know, lots of history departments now recognize other types of publication too, but it's a very text-based discipline, and it'll remain so for quite a while. I do think that the humanities in particular have a real challenge of being so based on the individual as opposed to collaboration, and so many other parts of research and discovery has moved towards collaboration. And collaboration, you know, both because you get more minds working on the same problem, but also because of interdisciplinarity, that the ability to have people come at it from a different perspective. I mean, anthropologists, sociologists, geographers, and historians might write about the same thing, and historians read some of the others. They don't read anybody else, but we don't really have the training and the expertise, and we're not interdisciplinary in the way that science is moving to be interdisciplinary. And I think that, you know, that's the real challenge when you know, you start seeing some publications that really take advantage of the knowledge across disciplines, then I think you may begin to see more collaboration. Otherwise, we stand out pretty much like sore thumbs, that we say only the individual can do it, and science is being done in teams and collaboration amongst teams in a very different way.
I don't know if you can show a minute of your apartheid. Just take a minute to look at that.
Sure. I spelled apartheid wrong. Twopiece? What? Oh, there it is. Google found it already, even though we didn't announce it. So this boy, it's taking a while to load. Shouldn't take that long to load. So this has a whole set of. This is why you don't announce it publicly before it's public. I don't know why it's taking so long to load. Oh, okay. So so this has a huge collection of different media, interviews. This is so these are multimedia resources by topic. There are essays written that draw upon the different topics. Let's see. This may be too. I mean, the idea was that this is a repository of material. So there's audio, there's video, there's written documents. There is an underlying sort of narrative so it can be used to teach. I'll show that in a second, to teach the history of overcoming apartheid. And then there are individual essays that draw upon the different, different resources. That was probably not a good example because it doesn't have embedded resources. So the different units. So it can be used both. This is a narrative that a classroom might use and work through, and you could have the students then read this and connect out, and it explains different terms, and they can see pictures. So it's a multimedia textbook in that way. But because all of the resources are in a database, you can build other things out of it. Nothing's locked into one format. Other questions?
So if you had a question on the documents that you really wanted to concern about that, you would suggest doing something like this and then putting it up on the website and letting the institution continue it for that perpetuity? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, I mean, I think publishing content, the collections online, and then in a way that people can work with it and do things with it and link to it. That's what Library of Congress, this is what the American Memory Project is, what Library of Congress is doing. So they take your collections and you put it online with persistent URLs and an ability to connect in and out of it. One of the main things that we've been doing at my center is trying to figure out how do you work with streaming media, with things that, with video and audio. So we have a tool that allows you to basically go to any video or audio online and collect a start point and a stop point, and then embed that anywhere else. So if there's a 2-hour interview, you can just take 2 minutes of it, and you could put that 2 minute into another web page, or you could put it into a paper. And we deal with the copyright issues in that we don't actually copy the audio. We just collect, we save start point and stop points, so that you could take, if you took my interview here of Ahmed Kathrada, somebody could write an essay about him or put an exhibit about him and put snippets of it, and they don't actually copy it over to their website. They actually point back and play it off of our website, and we play things off of Library of Congress's website. So you make the raw materials available, and we need to develop the tools that let people work with them and do things with them and write from them and analyze them.
Referred to the mass digitization of books earlier, and you didn't want to talk about it at that point, so now let's.
Oh, so I just recently gave a talk focused on history in the digital age. And when I gave my dissertation, and the book I wrote is called Why Americans Stopped Voting, and I looked at political participation in this country from the 1880s to the 1920s. And I spent an enormous amount of time I did quantitative analysis. So I looked at voting behavior, and I had to go from, a manuscript census and correct them, and there were errors, and it took several years of working with these numbers to run regression and run correlation analysis. To do that today, one of my grad students could replicate these several years' work in a week without a doubt, without any problem. And I've said that for a long time. And then I was thinking, I also did all this qualitative research because I was interested in what went on at the local level of politics. So because this was a national study, I wanted examples. So I actually looked at Indiana and Pennsylvania, and especially Philadelphia. And I read everything. I went to the Penn Library, and I went to the Library of Congress and around, and I tried to read all this basically ephemera published about politicians and anything that described politics in this period. And and it was ephemera. We're not talking about secondary works. You're talking about diaries and the like. And this was an enormous amount of effort, and I know that all I did was scratch the surface. All I did was find a few needles out there, because how do you find, who mentioned, I wanted to talk about the political bosses getting someone out of jail or something like this, and I find examples, and I don't know how frequent those examples are or anything. Well, you know what Google Books has done? Suddenly, if I went back to it and I put in the names of any of these politicians, I learned a lot of the, ward healers in Philadelphia and the guys in Indiana. If I put in any of their names, I could find any book that's been digitized from Michigan, from Harvard, from any of these libraries that mention any of these people today. In 2 minutes, I could find 5 times more than I did in 5 years of research looking for this type of material. Now, these are things out of copyright. These are things that many libraries wondered, why in the world did they keep on their shelves? Because nobody looked at them, because they're not, it's not that, really the type of useful book that you think. But suddenly that information is at your fingertips because of this digitization process. So that's my first anecdote, and I think that's really amazing to be able to do that as a historian, to think that all the junk published in the 19th century, the personal stories, the travel logs, and the like, all are going to be digitized, and and you could search and browse. But I think all Google's going to do with this is they're going to digitize it, and they're going to put it up in this list of a search page in order to sell ads next to it. And that's not really what we want as librarians. That's not what we want as scholars. We really want to be able to find things that relate to each other. We want to be able to cluster them. We want to create the Dewey Decimal System of inside the books. And I think that that's the challenge, that the libraries that are collaborating with Google, they're getting back all this digital material. And they're going to figure out how to build, and not in a year, and not in 5 years, but in 10 years, I bet. They're going to build tools that really let us work with the material in books down to the word level in really interesting ways. I mean, I know Stanford is doing this. Stanford has a lot of money, a lot more money than any of us, because it has all this Silicon Valley money. The Big Ten has just decided that they're going to collaborate in this, creating a CIC digital library. They haven't given any additional money to it. I think they may think they're going to do this on the back of the regular library budget, which is going to be next to impossible. But at some point, they have this big pot of text. All this, if you just take the stuff out of copyright, all this pre-1930s text, most of it was really hard. You know, all we had was cataloging information for the book, and suddenly you could figure out how to put this down to the word level and let people who want to find stuff in there find stuff in there. I want to know what these people, I wanted to know, as a scholar, I wanted to know what they said about these ward healers and politics at the local level, and when they had glee clubs and bake sales. And I wanted to think about what women were doing in the political system in the late 19th century when they couldn't vote. And this was, you know, this is way hidden. No one cataloged any books about this. You know, sort of went through the dusty shelves, and when they let me go into remote storage to find this, and suddenly all that stuff's going to be available. So I think that's pretty exciting. Does this replace reading a book from cover to cover? No, I can't read on the screen any more than anyone else my age can read on the screen in the same way. And you know, I order my hardcover books. I learned that the paperbacks don't last, and I order them and I read them. But they're two different things. You know, this is uncovering this huge pot of research material. That I didn't want to read all those books. I just want to see where in travelers' accounts did they talk about political activities. I didn't have to read all those books to find that stuff, but I could learn a lot from it. We had a meeting earlier this week with a company that's doing research on clustering, data mining. You know, if you have this enormous volume of material, a Google list is not going to serve the need of a scholar. I mean, I think Wikipedia works in many ways a lot better than Google. I mean, a Google list that gives you 10,000, 100,000 things, the historian has to look at everything. That's our obligation. That's the, you know, what we do in our profession. You need some way to put that material together to be able to say, this is what I'm interested in, show me things like this. And simple search and browse doesn't do that. So we met with this company that's working in Boston that's actually working for a federal agency with one of those three-letter initials that's keeping us safe, who wants to discover every time anyone says anything about bombs or certain types of chemicals or the like. So they're doing clustering of texts. Well, I said, gee, you know, you could do that to keep us safe, but how about working with the CIC Digital Library and let us, you know, I'll tell you the type of words things I want to cluster around. Show me anything around, you know, women's social life in the 19th century in the text, and identify those things. So I think we don't know how to deal with this huge pot of information. Suddenly it's available and it's exciting, and we haven't barely scratched the surface of what to deal with it. And if Google's going to pay to digitize it, I'm not going to complain too much that, you know, an occasional page isn't perfect. Someone else is going to come along too. You know, we can't afford to digitize it. We certainly can't do it by ourselves. Yeah.
Based on your experience, can you talk a little bit about the relationships and partnerships within a university that can cultivate and support, you know, work in the so-called digital humanities?
Yeah, I mean, I think my center works with faculty members in different disciplines. I think that they're, you know, that in education and information science and communication arts have a lot of connections to the type of issues that we want to think about in the humanities. And I think that librarians and museum specialists and archivists need to be talking to scholars. And I've been, you know, learned that, you know, archivists and librarians bring different perspectives to the same issues, both of which are often needed to really deal with these issues together. In today's world, you know, every professor I talk to in the humanities has something they'd like to do with something digitally. They've collected something and they'd like to save it. They've collected something and they want to use it in their classroom, or they'd like to illustrate, not very sophisticated, they'd like to illustrate something, or they'd like to put it in the classroom, and that that's a basis of starting a partnership, especially with a library. I mean, your institutional repository is a first step to figure out how to do that, and the next step is to get course management software that actually works with that, and to get we don't have course management software anywhere in the country that works very well right now. It's all starting from scratch each class, and and it's not really designed for the future, but we will. I mean, we will have a way to be able to, have our stuff in an institutional repository, have access to our colleagues' stuff, be able to draw upon it in our classrooms, and be able to think about it in research. Anything else? Well, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.